New Year's Eve?
Well, New Year's Eve ends a year. Indeed, it ends almost half of a decade in which a series of traumatic events had taken place, which were a wrench out of the preceding period, which was, Korea aside, a fairly good period for almost everybody, except, of course, minorities and those who were not of the mainstream. But we had had, by that time, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had had, by that time, a use of troops to integrate one university with one man. We had had, by that time, of course, the assassination of a president. We had had, by that time, the assassination of a couple of notable civil rights people in the Deep South. We had had, by that time, in fact, the election of a Catholic, which was in itself such a wrench from American history and tradition and likelihood as to cause great discomfort for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
So here we are. You've now got Lyndon Johnson, who is, in many ways, the accidental president, precisely not wanted as the vice presidential choice because so many of those around Kennedy knew him to be far too conservative, far too brutal in his appetites to be the right man for the golden days of the Kennedyites.
Right.
But of course, Jack Kennedy got elected because of Lyndon, which was always quite unpalatable to many of my friends among the Kennedyites.
Yeah.
So here we are, 64. The president is getting ready to consolidate his heritage because the things which had been initiated or at least spoken of by Kennedy were pending, most notably civil rights, which would be sort of the final little blow to the fracturing, but that was yet to happen, of a South.
What does like America look like and feel like at that moment? It's kind of like the black and white world.
Sure.
It's almost like a 50s America when you look at the pictures from people's yearbooks.
Well, one of the more interesting things is to look at some of the pictures of Democratic Party rallies in '60. And it's amazing. There's everybody in it except, of course, black folks. And they're just these huge things. It was still, in that way, the America, despite all this trauma, it was still in many ways the America which my parents, and well, maybe my parents' parents, they would have been traumatized by a Catholic, but it was not vastly changed in many ways. We had, however, had not great economy in the last few years. I mean, Jack Kennedy actually gets elected because there had been a downturn and he had difficulties immediately in his own time.
But I like that idea of it wasn't like it was in America that was sort of like your parents' America still. I mean,
Yeah,
it had this.
yeah, and
what was it about it? It just was this sort of tranquil, or at least.
Well, it stopped being tranquil. I mean, I have to say that because while we had gone back to war again in Korea and people had been really screwed over by being called up into that war, nonetheless, we had had a long period of steady economic growth. We had had a period in which the notion of the permanent middle class was born and seemed to become real. And it was for an awful lot of people. And a lot of people it wasn't. But amazing in American history how much we were a middle class country as opposed to our real history before then.
With really good appliances.
And never forget the appliances. To look at those ads is to be reminded of two things. One, how wondrous they seemed, and two, how naive we were about what the effect would be. Liberating my wife? Hell no. But I mean, but it seemed to be a liberating thing. And so, I mean, there were any number of things. And the cars, of course, were arrogant chariots and all the good stuff about the new permanent consumer economy, which was going to be of value to everybody.
And every guy looked like a carbon cutout of the next guy.
Are you trying to tell me that my little short-haired cut looking like some Princeton graduate was not the trendsetter? Of course we all looked alike. I'm trying to think about it. I guess by the time I got out of high school, there were, of course, the Grease boys. I mean, and there was hair to some degree.
Right.
After all, they don't make musicals unless it's based on truth. So Grease had to speak to something. But basically, the aspirational thing was to have a very narrow lapel and have a very narrow cut and to go out into the world with a very narrow tie. And live in a very narrow world of quite clear circumstances in which you advanced in one place, and that was that.
Were you madmen?
Were we madmen? I never had the chance to be a madman. They wouldn't hire me. But I mean, no, I was in a different world, of course, down in Mississippi in many respects. We weren't well off enough to yet meet that particular standard.
And women were equally carbon cutouts. You know, you look at the average homemaker in those ads and stuff. It's just remarkably.
Well, it's plastic. I mean, it was a terrible thing, actually, because by that time, women actually were going to school. I mean, for that matter, so were men. I mean, to higher education, which was a new thing in this nation. And they were coming out educated. And I can remember working in the 50s at a newspaper down in New Orleans, and the three of us who were rooming together dated three women, all of whom we married, all of whom had gone to university, all of whom come out quite bright, quite able, and went promptly to home and raised babies, and took care of Daddy when he came home and had the martini ready. If you think that that was a caricature, you had to see my house. I mean, that martini. Hello, honey, I'm home. Here's your martini, dear. And now, not everybody was drinking martinis. Not everybody drinks them today. I do. But, I mean, it was all part of the pattern.
Yeah.
And it was a waste of many, many people's talents among the women, not all of whom wanted to work, but most of whom found it unthinkable.
See, that's a great way of summing up kind of the consensus, if you want to call it that, that's existing. And then JFK is killed. How do you make sense of that break in American society?
I was just reading, which takes 500 years, Stephen King's novel about the possible alternatives if you had time traveling going on and what it did or didn't mean that he was killed. We were not idiots. We did not actually believe that the world was firmly implanted. I mean, terrible things had happened, by God. I mean, a couple of wars in succession, a succession of shocking events before Jack Kennedy, but mainly not involving whites. And the assassination of the president, though it was unfortunately in the noblest of American traditions, which is to assassinate presidents, was a shocker beyond shockers because he represented the future. And here he was cut off. He was the dream president for many people, God knows not all, who was going to sort of liberate us and at the same time guide us into a better future for everybody, in which we met our obligations to the world, we met our obligations to the Constitution, and we were led by a charming, good-looking person with a good-looking family with bright people all around him. And so, boom, he goes. And who succeeds him? Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is not a figure of great popularity in the general public. He is well known as an operator in the Senate, and a damn good one. But you've got Lyndon. Nobody's more aware than Lyndon of what people are doing with the comparison between the two. But you understand, whatever happened to the country, one of the things that happened to Lyndon Johnson was he was immediately enfolded in the martyr's aura and in the pull of the martyr's program, such as it was at that point, and as it had been partially articulated. So he, who actually, as it turned out, wanted to finish the business of the New Deal, is given this essentially open path.
And but he's smart enough to know how to take it.
Of course.
Because his instincts are extraordinary.
I mean, the man, Bob Caro, from book to book, he has a slightly, but I mean, the guy was a master politician. And he was a man who somehow could put his hand on the knee of both Hubert Humphrey and Senator George of Georgia, or Jim Eastland of Mississippi, and get them all to sort of say, now, boys, we're going to work this thing through. I know it's costly to you, but we got to do it. And he could do it beautifully. At that point, he was dealing with a full deck against an empty plate, as I say. So, and he did it. God almighty. But we're still here at the beginning of the year. We don't know what's actually all going to happen yet. He doesn't get his incredible supermajorities until the election itself of '64. But before he has that, he has already done something which hasn't been done since the Civil War, which is begin the process of making the South lose the Civil War a second time. It won the first Civil War in the long run, but it was in the process, and it began in a big way with Lyndon.
Great. He's kind of a, his pejorative nickname was Landslide, Lyndon.
Mm-hmm, certainly.
So he's got a lot at stake.
He does.
Psychologically and everything else in terms of this is an election year coming up, right? So
absolutely.
Put me in his mind on January 1st. What's he thinking?
Now, being in Lyndon's mind is a place I'm not sure I can go, but I mean, it's clear. I mean, he was not just like Lyndon Johnson, but like a lot of Southerners, still really defensively bitter about the esteem he was not held in by Yankees and by liberals and the like. And he knew that what he had to do if he was going to consolidate his position as president on his own was to move an agenda which would take that wing of the party and hopefully the nation along a path which they sort of thought Jack Kennedy wanted to go. He, I think, understood he had to move really fast because those things it's fashionable to talk about windows that shut, but the fact is they do, and he made damn sure it wasn't going to shut before he got done what he wanted to do.
Looking back now from today's sort of spinelessness, it was an unbelievably ballsy thing.
It was amazing. It was amazing. I mean, he was not an easy guy to like, but I'll tell you, at this point in history as well as then, I said, thank you. Thank you for delivering this creature at this moment into our presence and to be our president, because he's a guy who, wherever he is in his heart of hearts, is a guy trying to make good on the American promises, and he did.
To a degree that it's hard to imagine Kennedy ever could have even come close.
I don't believe that, in fact, as careful as he was, that he would have done it. He, in any case, will never know because he was never given the blessing of a completely blow away Congress. I mean, he was always having to, Kennedy, look over his shoulder at a rules committee in the House run by recidivist idiots and by, barons in the Senate who never really trusted him because he was never there as senator, and they saw him in some ways as a sort of, playboy of the Western world.
Yeah.
And he couldn't move them without Lyndon, and which of course had to hurt. On the other hand, every time I say something like that to a person who was close and dear, and there are those still around who were with Jack Kennedy, they say I'm full of it, that Jack Kennedy knew precisely where he meant to go in the second term, and he would have done what Lyndon would have done. And I trust them to believe what they're saying. I just don't quite see it on the basis of his record.
Yeah. The State of the Union is a huge moment for Johnson.
Yes.
It's like January 5th or something. What's at stake for him at that moment, and what's he got to do?
Well,
he's already done his "Let Us Continue" speech.
Yeah, I was going to say he's done his consoler-in-chief. He's done his unity speech as we are together going on. From here on, what he has to really
do me
do...
a favor, because that's a kind of important thing for us
Yeah.
narratively. If you could just do exactly what you just did, flash back to that "Let Us Continue" moment.
Sure.
And just say, in a nutshell, but it would be great if you could say, treat it as the "Let Us Continue" speech, because that's kind of how we're going to remember it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's already had to appear once.
Well, sure, and he was in a highly ritual moment in which he has to say to the people in the "Let Us Continue" speech that we are going to go forward with the heritage. We are going to make good on the promise. We are people who are not going to be destroyed by this. We are going to go on out. And that was important because it said two things simultaneously. I am the inheritor of and the fulfiller at that moment of what you elected. And second, that I am to be trusted not only rhetorically, but I promise you, we're going to be speaking as Americans to get on with it. And there had been, even then, we talk about divisiveness now. There was brutal divisiveness in those days, and increasingly so across the South. But, I mean, after all, when Jack Kennedy was assassinated, I had a reporter working for me who had come from Dallas in the Dallas Morning News, and he was, like many people, convinced that Dallas had produced the killer because of the right-wing crazies that were already there in place and implacably hate-filled about the events of Jack Kennedy's election and what have you. So that it was necessary to try to say, in effect, all right, look, we've gone to the brink here. Now let us get on with it and to make good.
Continuity is...
It is all important. It is all important. But continuity and the best of our instincts, I mean, that was represented by Jack.
But then he has this next huge challenge, which is the State of the Union.
And what is my program as opposed to what was a continuation program, that's always a trick, even when it's not a dramatic page turner in a real way. It's always a trick to give a speech that both summons people rhetorically to some kind of objective of higher value than just, but also to say, hey, here are things that are specifically doable and we're going to do them, and to say, here's where we go forward in truth as opposed to rhetorically. Now, my wife, who never really, my then wife, who did not really ever take to Lyndon, always thought that he was sitting there BSing everybody. I, of course, was being turned on with every other word and was thinking, great. And it didn't matter to me that he did not look like the most sincere man in the world, and often he did not. But I loved what he was saying, and I loved the possibilities of it. And I knew already that there was a counter force at work arising largely from elements in the South and elsewhere to undo it all and to get about it. So,
yeah, I was, and he what's interesting to me, I was reading Caro about, he gets the biggest headlines after the thing is that his budget is going to be smaller than Kennedy.
He loved that. It was an incredible thing. Do you remember what the budget was? No, I mean it was an asterisk in today's budget. And he was so determined that his budgets would not go over, and I'm making this up because I don't remember anymore.
100.
Yeah, 100. He was so determined that it wouldn't, that of course he took Social Security out of the equation so that it couldn't be, as it always had been, part of it. Because that was a, I mean, Lyndon understood at end of day, we all want all the goodies and we don't want to pay for them. And so, he was trying very hard to to deal with that.
He lays out one of his biggest initiatives is having to do with poverty.
And that was, you see, again, it's amazing, you see, because then you're suddenly reminded he actually knew something about poverty. I mean, he had seen it up close. He hadn't been in his limousine as he drove around being a liberal. He had been down in a poverty-stricken place. And he was an old New Dealer in his heart in many ways. And here he had this chance, again, to do something which in all truth had not been attempted. Lots of great things came out of the New Deal, not least being the belief that ultimately you ought to put a floor under people. But attacking poverty in a nation which is fond of quoting the wrong half of a biblical quote about the poor you shall always have with you, except the remainder of that quote is, and therefore you must pick up the task to undo their poverty. But we forgot that half of it and always just used the poor you shall always have with you. And Lyndon said, in effect, they don't have to. We are too rich, too able. We will overcome. Well, he didn't say overcome at that point, but but it was a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Stirring.
I'd forgotten that he watched his dad lose the ranch.
He watched his dad, yeah.
So this was personal to him.
It couldn't help but be personal. And he had watched a fair amount of failure, not merely of his dad, around him. And he had seen people walk away from the land because they couldn't hold it. I mean, he was Look, he comes out of every black and white newsreel you ever saw about the 30s and into 20s, and he knew it all. He knew it up close and personal. And there are two ways to deal with it if you come out of that background. One is to kick the ladder away, and the other is to say, not for others what I had to see and endure, we're going to change it. And he, strangely enough, not strangely, what am I saying? That's patronizing. He decided, by God, he was going to make that ladder secure and let him come up.
That's good. Meg, can you do a tiny touch-up for me? Yeah. Andy, you good? The other thing that he talks about, in addition to poverty, is civil rights equally forcefully, and they're completely interconnected.
They have to be. And again, in some ways, this is a root of some of our problems today. The genius of the New Deal was that what it did to lift people was seen as something which was across the board. It wasn't just good for poor people, it was good for most Americans. I mean, Social Security was a thing out there. Now, the fact it wasn't good for most people, because at that point the economy and the employment patterns were such that a lot of people, including mostly blacks, were not covered. Doesn't matter. Always the New Deal was quite aware that it had to have this base of the middle class behind it, and that therefore you did things which were universal rather than particular. When you pair the poverty war in time with the civil rights thing in time, you risk and probably harvest a great deal of connection between the black people or the poor people. What we're paying for anti-poverty work is to pay black people for being poor, and we are, after all, to be blunt about it, a racist nation, and certainly a racist South. And so it meant that you came out of the gate, and we did, full of enthusiasm, full of really fervently involved youngsters and oldsters in the poverty war, and fervently involved people in civil rights. It turned out to be about the same people, and there were a bunch of folks ultimately that were not part of that consensus in the involved sense. And that became later a difficulty politically. At the time, again, I'm saying, holy God, is this wonderful. I mean, we haven't had a president speak with fervor and honesty about race in my lifetime, period. And Harry Truman was a wonder, and he had done some things which were unthinkable, but they were executive order type things and nothing else. And that's utterly unfair to Harry, but it was a long, long road between Abraham Lincoln, who wasn't that big on the racial side himself, and this guy.
Right, great. The speech is incredibly, not just you, but incredibly well received. People call it masterful, and call Johnson presidential, which is exactly what I think he was hoping to try and.
Of course.
Just bring this out a little bit. Not everybody's applauding.
No.
What does Barry Goldwater and his ilk think of Johnson's great vision?
It's really, well, they think that it was the final step to.
Help me understand who we're talking about.
Yeah, Barry Goldwater, who strangely enough was a pretty decent man, was nonetheless of a frame of mind, as were many in the Republican right and even some in the center, convinced that most government intervention was socialism with a new face, and that massive intrusions into matters of choice and the like was both un-American and communistic in one way or another. And Barry, who again, I mean, if you want to see a decent man, I mean, he was a good, decent man, was nonetheless not able to connect the personal aspect of decency to the need for action in the larger sense. So he saw a great threat to America. And he was almost the perfect embodiment of the reaction against these things, because he didn't have a Southern accent. He was a man who could speak about principle without sounding like he was saying, and you'll pardon my French, nigger, 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 which was all the boys in the South who could barely bring themselves not to in fighting against these things. He also was the next step toward the right wing of the Republican Party's casting off of establishment Republican control. Notably, Tom Dewey was faced down by Dirksen in '48 and said, "You have led us down the road for the last time." And that was the notion of the conservatives, that the establishment Republicans were themselves not true fighters for principle. And here comes a guy who also is able to say to them, let's go where the ducks are. And in appealing to the anti-civil rights aspect of the reaction, he was beginning the process of reshaping the electoral map from what had been frozen from Reconstruction on into something we now are seeing the fulfillment. He also had some good speechwriters. And what's really strange about some of his most famous ones, which caused all of our necks to twist and our hair to rise on those necks, moderation in the defense, that's a great, not libertarian, it's a great American statement. Except coming out of him, it sounded like a clarion call to extremism. Maybe it always is, which is not a bad thing about it, since I don't believe in moderation in the defense of liberty. But he had some good speeches for that purpose.
What are his supporters so radicalized about? They've been trying to draft Goldwater since 1960. What are they so pissed off about? Why are these people so?
They've been losers since 1933. I think of my uncle, Yale, class of '36, who, as far as he was concerned, the world he knew had been destroyed by Roosevelt, by all of the New Deal, by what had transpired in the growth of the federal government, which was dramatic, and World War II was only part of that, and by the fact that what seemed to be the natural order of things, which was Republicans basically running the country with a few breaks by accident or whatever, that all of a sudden Democrats were running the country and had been running it since '33, and were doing things which were unthinkable. So
brief break for Dwight Eisenhower, but he was almost as bad.
No. See, Eisenhower was acceptable only because he wasn't a Democrat, but he was not what they were looking for, which was red meat and a repudiation of everything out there. He was certainly, look, I'm in college, I think he's anathema. But on retrospect, give me a break. He was a nice conservative guy who was going to preside over a nice conservative period of pretty much quietude and not much repudiation in reality as opposed to rhetoric of the past. Yeah. So, of course, he was no great, the hard asses didn't think anything of Eisenhower except as a vehicle to ride the Democrats out of town on and to bring some chance for change. And even that, which should have been the natural progression, gets broken when Nixon loses to Jack Kennedy.
There's this Western quality of Goldwater, too. There's this sort of insurgent thing. It's important.
It's a very interesting thing. Bob Caro and I are classmates, and we were Neiman classmates for that matter. And he's a brilliant man, but he just got it wrong about the guy that Lyndon beat down in Texas. But Coke Stevenson. Coke Stevenson was a racist pig. But he embodied all of that Western stuff. Highly individualistic guy speaking, a lot of the time in the language of that against this corrupt pig. Yeah. That is as Lyndon, as Bob was seeing Lyndon at that moment. Barry Goldwater had none of the corrupt baggage, and he was the Western man. He was the Southwestern man. He was, in many ways, the new America, which has been scaring liberals ever since. The idea of the new oligarchy arising from the wealth, mineral and otherwise, of that region.
And the Sun Belt.
Yeah, the whole notion of the Sun Belt, which is not given, I can't remember when that phrase came up, but he embodied it in any case.
Yeah, great. The Yaffers, they're an interesting
Well,
aspect.
they again, you know, as always, journalists believe if they can put a label on something, it means it's happened. And so in that period, you might want to remember, we went from the new left to the new right to the, I mean, I'm backing these things in reverse, the silent generation, whatever. The Young Americans for Freedom represented something real. I mean, which was more than some slogans and a bunch of guys running around carrying, you know, signs. They represented a part of the hard front of a attack on the establishment on the one hand in the party, and on the other upon the entire frame of things that had been created in the New Deal and thereafter. And some of them were quite bright and articulate, and some of them were exactly the kind of yard dogs you want. I mean, they'll bite you wherever they can bite you, and they were systematic. And their names still major figures in the Republican Party today who sort of came up that road in one way or the other.
Yeah.
And
I've talked to some of them. Yeah.
which ones have you
Lee
talked?
Edwards.
Yeah.
And
God.
Richard Viguerie, I
Yeah,
think,
Viguerie, of course.
coming in.
Viguerie, of course.
I don't want to get specifically.
No, I know that. But in any case, though that is an interesting case, he starts out as a Southern racist.
Right.
He finds a way to embody that. I used to see Viguerie around the Capitol back in the 60s. Anyway, okay, going back to where you.
But you're right. They're this passionate, really smart, organized group. They are a force.
And by that time, the essential decay of the Democratic Party as a institutional major magnetic force for everybody had begun. Too long in the saddle, too comfortable in its assumptions, too used to taking the big ones and winning, and not good at guerrilla and trench warfare. And here come these guys whose very idea is to go around the lines, do a frontal attack, come up behind you and knife you. I mean, they were terrifically able political people in ways that used to distinguish the old left from the hard left all the way to the center, which you weren't, increasingly you were never going to find. When they showed up in Greenville, Mississippi, and I covered the speech by, what's his name, Stanley, I can't remember anymore, but one of the founders, I came out of there and said, holy God, the past is coming back to bite us. Here they are, boy. These are wonderfully able.
One thing I'm trying to figure out is, well, the other thing is that by embracing these conservatives, Goldwater's at the same time getting with that package the lunatic fringe, right?
Absolutely.
How does he deal with that? And what's the challenge for him?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, because the people most turned off by the lunatic fringe are never going to vote for Barry Goldwater. So to a large extent, he did it basically by saying, oh, come on, you know, this is not. And in any case, Phyllis Schlafly's a wonderful American, you know, or whatever it may be. None dare call it treason. The whole list of them who were out there writing these things, which were essentially, in another country and another government, they would have been in jail, you know, suggesting that their people were traitors to the country. He didn't say that. And he essentially, he didn't disguise them. You couldn't disguise them. He just didn't incorporate them into the center of his universe.
The John Birchers.
Yeah. Oh, my God. But there was more than John Birchers. There were any number. The John Birchers are the most famous, but there were any number of these cells of passionate, true-believing lunatics. I mean, who actually believed that Moscow was at the center of virtually everything that had happened for a very long time, and that we were losing our freedoms fast, and 1984 was going to be too late. We will have lost them before we got to 84. And they preached all of that. And when I was working for Lyndon in the campaign, the stuff that came across the desk, I mean, I was working for Lyndon. Any rate, when I was working in the campaign in 64, the stuff that came across our desk was literally unbelievable, except people believed it. And that was the part that was scary.
Great. I'm not quite sure. We're really struggling to
Tell me.
divide Goldwater up into chunks in this story.
That's hard to do.
The announce is on January 3rd. The convention is in August. The only thing we can think about to drop down on in the middle of those two things is the California primary when he goes neck to neck, head to head with Nelson Rockefeller.
And I'm not good at that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the problem. Because I was...
You weren't there. You were on the other
I wasn't
coast.
there. Well, I was on the other coast. But even more to the point, I had essentially decided that was somebody else's monkey business, and we had enough problems going on up closer, and I was not. Now, let me think about that, though.
Well, how do you, more to the point maybe, because we've got plenty of other things to talk about. I mean, what is first Rockefeller and then Johnson in a huge way? How are they trying to paint Goldwater?
Extremist.
And why does it stick?
Extremist. That he was outside the normal confines of political discourse, that he was a man who essentially was trying to repudiate the things that most mattered to Americans, Social Security, still using that today, but and similar kinds of takes which would say, in effect, however good he may sound to you on some things, at the end of the day, he wants to destroy the things that are most meaningful to you, which has been created over this last 30 years.
What was he most vulnerable on?
Well, I always...
He goes on Issues and Answers in the California campaign and advocates the use of low-yield atomic weapons to defoliate the jungles of Vietnam.
No, I mean, he could say some of the damnedest things in the world. I've always been glad that one of the few things we didn't do in Vietnam while we were defoliating like crazy, we didn't use nuclear weapons, or we would have done everything he thought we ought to do. I mean, well, we didn't drop one down the stacks, as Curtis LeMay would have said. But we had never lost a war. We had never been in a war that we couldn't polish off. And it was still early in the day, but it was humiliating that we were not, in and out, that having decided to cast our lot with the regime, the rhetoric of the Kennedys was terrible when it came to Vietnam, and therefore you understood this was a place we were going to draw the line. And Barry, in effect, called that and raised it. I can remember going to a briefing at the State Department for the provincial press, in which Jack Kennedy stands in front of a big map of Vietnam, and he says, "For too long, the lines have gone south eternally. Here's what I tell you, we are going to go north from now on," meaning into North Vietnam, to take them at the source and all that. I said, yeah. And was gunboats Carter for some time because of Jack Kennedy, not because of Barry Goldwater. Goldwater just took it further.
And Goldwater, why was he so, the extremist label is really important.
Well, among other
His
things.
talk about nukes was pretty.
But that was, yeah, of course, which was what, of course, made that insanely effective but never used ad, or hardly ever used ad, so meaningful, is that it was, of course, capturing one whole sense of people's belief about him. Pull off the pedal, and nuclear explosion.
But where did that sense?
Well, see, I don't know, and that's the part I've never quite understood, and I used to read stuff about him, and then I quit thinking about him. Yeah. I'd see him around Washington a lot. Big friend of Ben Bradley's. But in any case, it was
mostly just these comments that he made. He wanted to lob a missile into the men's room of the Kremlin, is one thing he said.
That's extraordinarily, that's the kind of thing I say, but I'm not running for president. You know what I mean? It was a level of irresponsibility on the rhetoric which was sort of stunning for a guy who, after all, had held public office of various kinds for some time. He understood. The thing is, though, Barry, I don't think actually smart or not smart, and there were those who argued both ways, I don't think he understood the world he was in, and I don't think he understood the difference between being a politician from Arizona and being a man who's running for president. And you could get away with saying almost anything if you wanted to run for the Senate.
Did he want to be president?
Well, you know, there are a lot of people who ask, did Al Gore want to be president? What I mean is, I can't answer that one. But he ran. And I don't think that he may have thought running was a splendid misery, but he didn't show it. I mean, he was out there having a good time and accepting a series of campaign positions which were not funny. I mean,
what were they, some of them?
oh, well, God.
Mostly just
Homophobic, for one, because of Walter Jenkins and other of Lyndon's aides.
Although he didn't exploit that, which was kind of interesting.
I'll tell you why. Can I tell you a story? I'm working on the propaganda side, and so that thing happens. And we think, oh my God, this is, devastating for a while. And then two things happen immediately thereafter. The Chinese set off their bomb within 2 days, which was devastating, and Khrushchev fell. And my friend, everybody forgot about Walter Jenkins. I mean, it was not an issue to be pushed when you had these huge events taking place right then. They would have pushed it further, but they also got about as much out of it as they could get to begin with.
But he's against Social Security.
He's against Social Security. He's against. He.
Give me the sort of
At the end of
the laundry list
at end of day, I don't remember where he was on NATO, but I'm confident that he was one of those who would have not been reluctant to see us essentially withdraw from the advanced position and be the great. Sorry, folks.
That's right. He wanted NATO commanders to have.
I'll tell you about that.
Access to nuclear weapons.
Are you kidding? When I think of Edwin Walker, I can't talk right now.
So yeah, I want to take a break in a sec because we're going to.
Well,
turn
do that. I just realized the one thing I didn't do was turn this off. Wait a minute. This is 85 years old, obviously. Yeah. Okay.
I'm just kind of curious, in a big picture, 10,000 feet up kind of view, what's sort of Goldwater's general kind of bomb-throwing agenda? Just in really broad strokes.
In really big strokes, he was sort of, in many ways, a real libertarian with an inclination to trust the military, which does not follow for a real libertarian. He was a guy who believed in the old American values as understood by many old Americans. He was a guy who believed that you progressed best when less hectored by government or compelled by government. He was a guy who believed that most of the economic policies of the New Deal were socialism with a kind face. He was a fellow who, at root, thought that there was a natural governing class which would rise by achievement, and that that's where you sort of take your lead.
Was there something about him, though, that was kind of appealing?
Yeah.
He was the guy who wouldn't play a politician.
I mean, I found it to be charming that he would say these crazy things, because it meant at least he wasn't so confined by handlers. Of course, it drove him crazy, but I mean, that a person didn't emerge and a real person emerged. And that was one of Lyndon's problems, actually. You were never sure who the real person was. In retrospect, you're much better able to know that a lot of that was real for sure and not, as my wife thought, just political, whatever just political is supposed to mean. Right. Barry, you figured, he believed all that stuff, and then there was something to be said for that. Authenticity then and now is not a vice, unless, of course, it's not an authenticity that a majority welcomes. And what he was offering was authentic Barry, but it wasn't authentic America at that moment.
Great. Let's take 5. Let's turn the air on. We can. Here we go. Let's talk about Vietnam for a sec. Small little issue, 1964. But actually, the more I look at it, the more I think 64 is the year that some critical things happen. Why is it such a nightmarish thing for LBJ? Why is Vietnam?
Well, to begin with, of course, LBJ understands some things better than others, and being seen as somebody who cuts and runs is a problem for us. Second, it was, after all, Jack's legacy, and he wasn't sure exactly how they would bite if he did a major withdrawal. Third, he thought, as unfortunately a number of people thought, even then, that it was doable, that it was a Fourth, we were all children of Munich. We were all children of World War II. It wasn't just Halberstam who understood that we were infected with the notional thing that if you let them do it here, they'll do it there, that there was a whole set, if not of dominoes, then certainly of interconnected events which would advance the cause of the other side. And I bought all of it, by the way. I bought it to the last T, because I was a child of Munich. My father had gone off to war because of Munich. He had joined before the war started because he knew it was coming. And I believed it confirmed everything about the need to take a very early stand wherever it was. All of that was there in front of Lyndon. It was in front of the country. And in fact, it stayed there for a lot longer than people are willing to admit, including the New York Times. I mean, there was a long time support for that war. Even David, an old friend, did not, in the days he was in Vietnam, say get out. He said fight it better.
Yeah, you read what's amazing about the making of a Quagmire is how much he wants us to win.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But we all did. I mean, we were children of Munich, children of World War II, children of the notion that if we'd only move faster, blah, 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 wherever it was. And I, for one, am not embarrassed by it. It was just the fact of a history that made you forget about thinking.
Was LBJ particularly vulnerable on foreign affairs, or is that a stereotype of him?
I don't think that he was vulnerable in foreign affairs in the sense that he was more ignorant of foreign affairs than most people. In fact, he probably knew more.
He was been to Vietnam as vice president, I think.
Yeah. No, yes, he did. He went to a number of places as far as they could get him from Washington for some of those people. But the thing about it was he was an expert on the defense side. I mean, for any number of reasons, not least being the fact placing defense plants all over the country, or bases rather, was useful politically. But sure, but most people, I mean, you take Fulbright, the great expert, and that's fine. But, it takes a long time for most folks to come up to speed on a strange place where the slogans sound very familiar from our past, and the complexities are more than you really want to wrestle with.
Yeah. It's fascinating to listen to him talk about, with Richard Russell about it, because they're just...
You mean the tape calls?
Yeah. He's just basically saying, like, I don't know how to get out of this.
I know.
And he's like, I don't know either, but it doesn't look good. And it's just all the doubts and all the problems that are going to fall apart. They're all on the table in 64.
I so admired that handful of men who actually did leave over it. They were such a small handful. And I am so sorry that Lyndon couldn't bring himself to listen to some people he otherwise trusted a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, but anybody who was close to that, unless they were entirely doctrinaire like McNamara, had to know that that was a mess.
Yeah.
But of course, I wasn't close to it, and I knew we had to stop the bastards. That was sort of the notional thing.
Who were you in 64? I mean, where'd Gunboats Carter come from? Just in the...
Because when it was not yet to be Gunboats Carter, I went to the Neiman the next year and spent a great deal of time debating two of the great experts on Vietnam, a Frenchman named Jean Lacouture and Bernard Fall of this country, both of whom knew more in their little finger about Southeast Asia than I knew in my entire body. But I was willing to put ignorance to work for a cause, and so was the ritual defender of the war. My classmates are the ones who called me that in my Neiman class, Gunboats Carter. And it was a fair enough deal. It was, of course...
Why'd they call you that?
Because my basic...
What did they call you, and why did they call you it?
I was called Gunboats Carter because my basic thesis about what you did when facing the enemy in Vietnam or anywhere else, but certainly there, was to go in there shooting. I mean, and keep shooting until you beat them. That again arises from watching my father go off to war before the war began, even because he believed you had to. Yeah. It also arose because that's basically what we got taught in university and history and in high school about the meaning of World War II. And God knows if you watched us ineffectually flailing around for a while in Korea, you knew that not being ready to fight well meant embarrassment and death before you finally pull yourself together.
What were your views at the time? Did most of America agree with Gunboats Carter?
Mm-hmm. Sure. No, it's a funny thing. Most of America in '64 sort of, even at the end, here's what happened. Most Americans were against it at the end, but you don't want to parse that figure too far because many of them were against it because we weren't winning. And if we weren't going to win, we ought to get out. And then there were others who were against it because they thought it was an absurd war. But an awful lot of those who registered in the polls as being against the war were against the way we were fighting it and therefore said to hell with it. I mean, if we're not going to fight it to win, as the saying went,
right.
then out. But as late as '68, you still had, Cronkite doesn't go. And the New York Times.
Kids start to die.
Yeah, well, I can remember when my best friend's family, a boy came home from that war. I think that began to change everywhere.
Yeah. LBJ is on the campaign trail telling Americans, I'm not going to send American boys to fight. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he's doing exactly that.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. In the
LBJ
finest tradition of American presidencies when it comes to overseas ventures, he kept us out of war. I'm trying to think of an American president, actually, who lived up to his rhetoric about being involved. Certainly not Woodrow Wilson, who got stampeded into the war, and certainly not Lyndon. I went to work for Lyndon in the end because I sure as hell didn't believe in us having troops on the ground in that sense. John Stennis, the senator from Mississippi, the defense expert, an old friend of Lyndon's, used to say correctly that he argued with Jack Kennedy and he argued with Lyndon about not making this be a ground war. If you want to blast them in the Stone Age, fine. Do not go in there in a land war in Asia that's unwinnable and it's unthinkable, and don't do it. There were a lot of conservatives who were against it. I, again, was a passionate ideologue to one extent. Now, it begins to get complex about '64. By '65, when we're using high-altitude bombing and putting in another bunch of people, everything I'd learned in the Marines was being absolutely turned on its head. Because what they taught us was you don't fight that kind of war with that kind of method. If you can't win it on the ground and up close and personal, then get the hell out.
Great Society. It's kind of he's in Michigan, University of Michigan commencement in May, and he announces, he gives it a label. Why is the label important, and why was the idea of the Great Society important to Johnson?
Well, look, one of the great things about any set of ideas is to make a title or a catchphrase which can catch hold. The New Deal, the Fair Deal. The Great Society, I have no idea ultimately, who came up with that phrase, but it incorporated his wishing to say to us, we ought to be as great as we say we are, and we ought to be a society that makes good on its promises to all of its people, and we can do it. We can do it. It was perhaps the last time that anybody actually presented to the American people the doability of things simultaneously, and nobody said it was impossible. A lot of people said you shouldn't do it, But it was still seen as possible to have guns and butter and to do these things. Absolutely repellent to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But, God, that just, frankly, that's what really blew me away. That whole succession of the Great Society and where I was and where an awful lot of Americans were, it offered such hope for so many people. And was so complex, of course, that it was almost automatically set up to be called a failure, which is exactly what it wasn't. It just wasn't a success in its own terms, and that's not being cute.
Yeah.
What it did was it empowered tons of people, gave them tools, gave them independence, gave them everything the conservatives said. It was a subsidy for folks who needed to have some backing in their workplace and in their community. And those organizations of the Great Society provided the frame for many of the things that were to come.
And Johnson needs to make it his, right?
Well, of course it is his. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. I mean, it's the audacity. I mean, forget the audacity of hope. It was the audacity of saying, I will now fulfill, Moses led us out of the wilderness. That's, his son began the process. That's Harry. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to bring us into the kingdom, which we have always claimed was ours. And we shall be there liberated together. And it was wonderful. God, it was wonderful. I still get extraordinarily sad about the way the war consumed that as Lyndon became increasingly obsessed with the war. But in that 64, 65 period, 64, my God. I mean,
You listen to the speech, it's the idealism is
it's just, now, again, because he's Lyndon and because Lyndon looks like he's selling you something bad, even when he's the most, it was hard for some people to understand just how much he meant it, but he meant it. The civil rights business to come, he meant. He understood it. I mean, I'm tired of hearing the return over and over again to this is the end of the South. Well, yeah, but I mean, whether or not he really thought it was going to mean the end of the South, he certainly knew the consequences to a large degree, and he thought the consequences for America were well worth the gamble.
Let's talk about civil rights. I mean,
Yeah.
He has a huge amount to gain, but a tremendous amount to lose by taking his presidency early on. You think Obamacare was a big roll of the dice?
Yeah, but you see, there's something that you got to remember here is, unlike Obamacare, which is the nearest thing to a Frankenstein monster I ever see get put together legislatively, and I mean that literally, the Great Society was the incorporation of a number of quite distinctly thought through things, and if you want to listen to some Kennedyites, most of them thought through by them before Lyndon ever took it over. The fact that that's not true doesn't really matter because it's part of the myth, and that's fine. But he had not a on the ground piece by piece, but he had the vision of what was required. He knew what you had to do to break the public accommodations question. He knew what you had to do to break the voting problem, and he did it with remarkable. Anybody who worked in the war on poverty know coherence was not precisely its middle name, but nonetheless, each of the programs had, in the best tradition of foundations actually, most of those programs have been pre-tested in one place or another by Ford Foundation and others as to how they might work. Yeah. And I'm giving Ford too much credit. Anyway, they had been pre-tested in many instances. And then on top of that, there was this now finally a groundswell decision for the first time by a large number of Americans outside the South that it was intolerable that they should be given a free pass anymore. There had been one too many killings by then. There had been one too many riots, and this is before Freedom Summer in '64 when there was, And so he was riding that on civil rights. On the war on poverty, he could, in all truth, argue that this was just the extension of where we had been going with what we had done in the 30s, postponed by the war, stopped by reaction for a while, and now we are able to do it. It never hurts, again, that the very thing that liberated Lyndon, of course, empowered a supermajority, not before the Civil Rights Act, but nonetheless thereafter for many of the things that he was going to do in the Democratic Congress. I mean, suddenly you have this, this huge groundswell.
How does he get it? How does he get it done? I mean, you ask somebody in March of '64 whether the President of the United States can pass Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill, they will say no fucking way.
No. And absolutely, because, of course, you had intact the same Congress that had faced Jack Kennedy in the not down, but just made him go slow. Because the man knew how to make every lever in the political system work. He knew how to go to people and tell them, come on, let's do a little trading off here. You and I both know this is right. He could take advantage of the fact that there was a well-organized left in Congress in those days, pocket that, and then go to people like Everett Dirksen and say, it is time for us all to join together for history and for America, and to get on board conservatives who you would have thought would never do it. There's some irony in that, of course, that some of those, quote, conservatives were, of course, inheritors of a Republican Party, which had always been the party of racial something, change we might call it, whatever. And there I just killed history with that one. That some of the people he convinced to come along were, after all, not living in societies that found it alien to believe that you ought to do some things for the least of these, our brothers who are black.
Yeah.
Not a lot. But he was able simply to reach across the table. And I was stunned. Now, you understand, I was colored somewhat by the roaring reaction of my own area, so that I would have said, holy God, no way. It was a liberating moment, man. I cannot tell you how liberating it was to get that one out. Because after that, you could put the other pieces down, because you had broken the biggest shibboleth of all, which was, they're going to be in the same place as me. We are going to be here together. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 means what? That I am going to have to sit at the same, all of that.
Yeah.
The Voting Rights Act.
Everything.
Oh, no, everything, of course.
Movie theater.
Everything. And, of course, and the South had done a wonderful job since '54 of dragging it out in ways that were, in many ways, unthinkable. Since Brown versus Board, which was a basic desegregation decision involving one set of things, but nonetheless seemed to be the death knell at the time for segregation as we knew it. And then the South went into massive resistance and fought it out, so that you were just beginning to have some breakthroughs by '64 in some parts of the country, certainly not in mine. And it required the passage. It required, frankly, finally, the perhaps not enthusiastic, given J. Edgar Hoover, but nonetheless passionate involvement of enough of the federal government to finally start forcing things through that should have been forced through before. I mean, much of the bureaucracy had always been responsive to the Southern barons. Well, now they had a government in place in the White House who said, you only think that those guys are tough. We're going to make this work. And that was helpful.
How did your neighbors and friends in
Greenville,
how did they respond to what Johnson was trying to do?
Now, we got to be really careful here. 90% of all the white people in Mississippi and in the South, Deep South, thought, oh my God, I mean, this is unbelievable. Forget everything else. A man's property is his castle. What do you mean you're going to tell me who I have to serve? What do you mean this is an assault on a basic American right? You reserve the right to preserve your place as you wish it. They were infuriated not merely by the fact that we were having integration by fiat, but also infuriated by the propositional underlying, which was that there was a right to deny your basic right to the integrity of your ownership. I mean, that there were things that went beyond property rights in the American lexicon of virtue. And, at that point, of course, it didn't matter about the rest of the country. You knew Mississippi was lost forever, and with the exception of Jimmy Carter, it was, and that was it. Now, the other part of it, nonetheless, is that even some of those, and certainly the minority of others, understood that we had just been liberated. Because at that point, it was no longer that some handful of white radicals, no matter how conservative we were attacking the system, or that black folks were attacking the system. It was that the system was saying, no, we have tolerated you forever. Now the federal government says, we're not winking at you anymore. The federal government is now saying, this is meaningful. It's comparable to us in the West finally saying to South Africa, look, sorry guys, you're not part of the West. We know you've been using that thesis, but you're not. And suddenly we're telling the South, we were being told in the South that wink, wink, no more. You've got to come through.
That's great. And in the end, it's kind of ironic, but it was the thing that ultimately brought the South back into the country.
It did it in several ways. Well, bringing the South back into the country was the inevitable result of succession of civil rights acts. The Voting Rights Act the next year, I have to say, was stunningly necessary. Yeah. But by that time, I don't think anybody thought it wasn't going to pass. Well, I'm probably wrong there, but in any case, it seemed inevitable. But bringing us back into the country, in a way, lets the country off the hook as well, I'll say again. We had been idiosyncratic since Reconstruction because we were left alone. When we come back into the country, we come back in very much under common rules, but not to common purpose. I mean, much of the white South to this day does not accept the underlying proposition of the acts. We used to have a one-party system because of Reconstruction. We now have a one-party system, at least in part, because of the second Reconstruction, and the sense that there's only one home for the white man. In the old days, it was the one-party Democratic system, and now it's a one-party Republican system. And here is not good news for those who think history is an arc toward whatever. The arc
of history bends toward
yeah, you're right. At this point, the arc of history in the South at the local and state levels bends in quite a different direction into forms of reaction, economic and other, which would not be unfamiliar to my old state, 40 years ago.
Let me jump ahead because I don't want to exhaust us with too much. I want to keep moving. We can always circle back.
As I say, I filibuster. Yeah. Go ahead.
While all these speeches are being made in Washington, what's happening in Mississippi?
Well, a lot of stunning things, actually. The preceding year, in '63, the Freedom Democrats had been formed and ran an alternative candidate for governor, since, of course, blacks couldn't really vote in Mississippi beyond a few thousand. Alternative candidate for governor and lieutenant governor, which caught the eye of many folks in the country. By '64, you had seen brought together, and again, because of the events in Mississippi and elsewhere, made it seem like a cause worth fighting for a lot of young people. You had brought together, in truth, the Freedom Summer, which was an attempt by largely idealistic college kids and somewhat older to come into Mississippi to try to help them integrate the voting booth, to try to help them work on housing, them meaning black folks, and to live among them and to be, in effect, the new Freedman's Bureau of bringing in the possibility of real change and saying the rest of the country is with you. That stirred the beast. The Klan had been pretty much crushed in the 20s because the upper class, the Bourbons and others, found it to be an irritant and of no great use, and besides which they weren't their class at the time, the old Klan. By the time of the 64, there was various white organizations around which were dedicated to the proposition that we are going to keep integration up, we're going to keep segregation without violence. They were losing. And starting with the great cascade of massive promises of radical change from these youngsters coming in, the Klan reforms in a huge way. Not that the Klan ever died, but it had not really been functioning very much. So comes the summer, and all of a sudden these freedom schools and houses are popping up all over Mississippi, and with them come burnings and explosions and what have you. But the biggest thing, of course, that happened was visibly 3 kids got lynch murdered over in Neshoba County, Mississippi. And it was inescapably horrible because it was so blatant. They're there and then they're not there and they're vanished. And Lyndon ain't going to take that. And God knows that J. Edgar Hoover didn't give a damn about any of this. He hated to involve his people in messy things that left-wingers wanted. But Lyndon, in effect, said, get the FBI in there and find these things and get it done.
Because it's a big problem.
It's a huge problem. It's intolerable. While he's promising this whole new thing coming, the Civil Rights Act has not yet passed, but it soon will in that summer. And so he does send them in. I was sitting in a room when Allen Dulles was sent down on a fact-finding mission to talk to the establishment of Mississippi, the governor and big business types and everything. We're sitting there, and Allen says, well, what do you think's happened? And one of them says, they're in Cuba. And Dulles puffs on his pipe, and he says, really? I said, of course. This is all meant to humiliate Mississippi. There's nothing wrong with those boys. They're just playing a left-wing game. They've gone to Cuba. And Dulles, who was imperturbable, clearly almost went and swallowed his pipe, listening to this crap. In any case, that event was a major deal, which would devil the Republican convention in San Francisco later. Where are they? They were saying, marching around the Mississippi delegation, which was pure Goldwater, at San Francisco, the Republican convention. But Mississippi had to reconfirm its first Republican congressman, not on the basis of him being some old Republican, but him being a guy who could say, if you want to preserve our way of life, abandon the party of your fathers, which has already abandoned us, and let's all get aboard a party that will reflect us. A turning up of history which was amazing and yet utterly correct. That is, there was not going to be a hospitable place for the Old South, increasingly in the Democratic Party in process.
Can we get back to Schwerner, Goodman,
Yeah.
and Cheney? In a way, the reaction to their disappearance confirms everything that Bob Moses and others were thinking about why white kids needed to come to the South that summer. Right?
Certainly. It was.
What was so surprising about it? I mean, black bodies are turning up every month.
Look, I keep saying this just to infuriate everybody, but essentially, white America doesn't give a damn and didn't give a damn about black America in the same fundamental way that 1,000 people can die in a ferry accident off of blah, and we get nothing out of it, and 2 people die in an automobile accident. It's an 8-paragraph story. I mean, if it's here in America. Well, the same thing was true, but difference between what happens to white folks and black folks. But second, the type of kids who went down there were two. One, classically upper middle class, educated folks of tremendous idealism, and two, red diaper babies of one kind or another who already were passionately committed out of their own backgrounds and were going to go down there to, in effect, use this as another test case to change the nature of the society. By that time, we were free speeching all over the place here, and we were SDSing there, and things were underway which were changing much of the nature of how young America was behaving, or at least that fraction of young America that always is a substitute for reality. And it was to the precise embodiment of their thesis that it would only be whites getting beat up, it would only be whites being killed, which would so capture the political attention of the country as to hasten the day of change.
How did it affect you personally?
It was the end of the game for me. I had been very careful for a long time. I wanted to stay in business. The white people in Mississippi didn't think I was careful, but according to how I was careful. I wrote editorials about putting Ross Barnett in the federal prison and all that stuff when he tried to confront the federal government over Ole Miss, but the death of those boys was it. I said, to hell with this. I can't just write editorials. I can't just sit here and be an observer while this kind of thing is happening in my state at a time in which change is supposed to be coming, and every lever of power in this state is being used to stop it, including violence, as though we were back in the period of Reconstruction when they forced back the federal government by insurrection. And I said, that's what's going on. And it was. It was an attempt to force back the feds in the same way they had in the post-65 to 76 period, 1865, 76. So I said, that's it. And I got involved. Slowly. First I covered the Republican Convention and the Democratic Convention. The Republican Convention finished my determination that if this represented a major American party, then we were in deep trouble. And that
let's go there in just a second.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's anything else we want to talk about with Freedom Summer, because that's great.
Well, it was look, it's an old hymn. Once to every man and nation comes a moment to decide. And that was it. If that couldn't make you decide, then you weren't going to decide except to stay with the old flow. And for a lot of us, I'm sure, but certainly for me, that was it. At that point, throw off the mask, throw off the restraint, and And again, if you read what I wrote in those days, some of it sounds like something written by some yaffer about some aspect. I can't remember what, but I'm sure I did.
What was your job at the moment?
By 64, I was editor. By 64.
Of what?
No. I know. By 1964, I was editor of the family newspaper, the Delta Democrat-Times of Greenville, Mississippi. My father had founded it in 1936, had won a Pulitzer for racial tolerance editorials in 45, had been an single most important object of white hatred among whites in Mississippi thereafter, and that's where I'd grown up. And I was given the great gift of running that newspaper when I was too ignorant and arrogant to know I didn't have the ability to do it well, but it was a great, great war, the last good war of this country. And it was terrific to have that opportunity. Thank you, Dad, as we say, but it was a great job.
Did you ever have violence visited on your family?
I can't tell you the number of threats there were, but there were two things people knew about the Hotting Carters because it was true. One was, oh gosh, horrors for those of you gun haters. One was they knew we carried guns. Second, they knew we had guns in the house. And third, they knew that there was not much hesitation about it. There was no restraint. There were any number of threats. My growing up is full of memories of Dad slamming down the phone saying, "You know, son of a bitch, come and get me." And then he'd go out and he'd sit there next to the car with a 45, his old service 45, and a buckshot shotgun, and wait for them to come. And they never came. And on the night of Ole Miss, we lost 10% of our circulation right at that moment when the troops went in. And they came at us, but we were standing out rather ostentatiously outside of the house and what have you. So they burned the cross the next night when we were all in bed, exhausted. But no, we never, ever were directly assaulted. And why it was I didn't have my ass beat to the ground, I do not know, because I went around all the time, and I was scared to death, but it didn't happen.
It's a great story. You go and cover
Yeah.
the Cow Palace. What was it like?
I went to cover the Cow Palace as a person covering my state's delegation. I mean, we were a very poor newspaper. We didn't send people out there to do the job of the national press, so I went with the Mississippi delegation. And the Mississippi delegation was basically a very hard right-wing delegation and segregationist. It was essentially led by my very good friend, a man named Clark Reed, who from there till now is a godfather of the Republican Party in the South and a figure of some significance, and out there was very much a Goldwaterite, as the whole delegation was. And so it was terrific. I mean, I got a chance to be right at the center of the takeover and to be able to write stories that the rest of the national press laughed at me about. Like I said, on Sunday, the vice presidential nominee is going to be William Miller. And I'll never forget Dick Harwood of the Washington Post saying, "You are so full of crap." He said, "They're never going to nominate Miller." I said, "Yeah, they are." Because those guys were right at the center of the Republican rights takeover.
What was so striking about this convention compared to the previous ones? 73% of them are Goldwaterites who've never even been to the.
Well, that's the thing. It was in effect the Tea Party in its first phase. I mean, that is, these are folks, true believers, who understand that the Republican Party has sold out principle in the past, and that they are ready, by God, for a real Republican Party, and they want a real American Republican Party, and they are
conservative, right?
Of course,
That's
but
the
I'm
key
putting
word.
that in quotation marks.
Right.
I mean, of course, conservative. They were Tea Party guys. I mean, and they did a beautiful job. If I were a Tea Partyite, I'd look to that example and would say, we did it before, we can do it again, and they are. They were cosseted even by some of the establishment Republicans because they seemed to offer the hope of a national majority which didn't have to overcome the fact of a solid South voting the other way for Democrats. I'll never forget standing at a telephone, in one of those freestanding telephones in the lobby like this, and I'm calling in something to the paper, and I suddenly hear this yapping voice. "That's right, George Bush. I'm with him 100%. Yes, on the Civil Rights Bill, he's absolutely right. He has got it right. Goldwater, right. George Bush, right." I never had any faith in the integrity of George Bush from that moment till now, and I'm not talking about the son. Just yapping along, this betrayer of his own family's heritage, his father having been a participant in civil rights legislation as one of those establishment Republicans. Now he's down there in Texas, yapping like an idiot, lackey of the oil people and the racists. It was disgusting. Anyway, it was a rare moment that I would be so close to the delegation and get a chance to really listen to them. They let me into everything except and of course a lot of them, they didn't trust me worth a damn, except that I was a good friend of Clark's, and I was actually a friend of some of this is also a matter, just to get right down to it, of class. I mean, so a lot of them, we knew each other because there was a small group of whites to begin with in the state, and then there's a smaller group of whites who went to college, and it's just that same class thing. And
so what was the overall
aura?
like? Yeah.
Oh my God. Now look, I'm easily made hysterical, by false illusions. And so I was confident that I saw jackboots and I could see books burning and the mob screaming, I mean, as they shouted down or tried to shout down Nelson, Rockefeller. They went crazy when, what was it Eisenhower said? Something about columnists and commentators. I can't remember anymore. But
we want Barry.
Yeah, well, of course, We Want Barry was nonstop, and also some variation on the Latin, the Mexican chant.
Ole.
Yeah, Viva. And then when he gave that speech, I'm listening, and I suddenly realized what the words may mean one thing to me. They mean something really different deliberately about the whole question about whether or not you could be moderate in defense of liberty. And it was a rare moment in which there was a true, now I'm thinking I'm being naive, I now know there's hardly anything truly spontaneous at conventions, but I think at that convention, when that phrase was uttered, while the cheerleaders may have started it, it was deafening, the reaction to that. That was it. They were people on a mission which was in the best American tradition, to be emphatic about the redemption of our values and to be immoderate in advancing their position. It was amazing. It was amazing.
Wow, great. That whole Rockefeller moment, what's Rockefeller trying to do? He's baiting them.
Well, of course he's baiting them.
We forget, of course, now that there were liberal Republicans, so mainstream Republicans who
you know what? I have a really good friend who was working for him then, and I've never actually pursued this one into what may be reality as opposed to various analyses, so I can't answer for that, except that he is, after all, the paladin of what's left of the establishment. Somebody has to get out there and say, no, this is not the Republican Party, that we are people of a different background. We are the party, the grand old party, which has real meaning, and that not everybody is going to be here. I cannot believe by that time he didn't have total counters. I mean, on the other hand, it's been so long since there was actually an unstructured convention that you forget that there were times when things could turn conventions.
Right. But Goldwater pretty much had it locked up.
Oh, he had it locked up.
Cliff White had it locked in.
Cliff White was, of course, a master. And that was, it's a horrible thing to be at this business so long that you admire some of these stunning technicians because they're so good at what they do.
I want to get to Atlantic City, but before we do, a couple things happen in the summer between the conventions. One thing is Harlem explodes.
God, I forgot that.
Yeah, it's not by the standards of Watts and other things that come later. It's a little intro, but it's shocking.
I'll tell you a story. There had been two eruptions there, one earlier in the 60s and then there. And in one of them, I don't remember anymore, the New York Times wrote, so help me God, in recent years, Negroes in Harlem have become increasingly frustrated by their situation in recent years. Which meant, of course, that the New York Times had been not paying any attention whatsoever to Harlem for 100 years. And it was a wonderful moment of recognition that the whole question of race had been largely put aside, even by the finest of the establishment press. My brother was working for the New York Herald Tribune for a while at the beginning of that period of the Freedom Rides. Which is early 1960s. And he covered Brooklyn for the Herald Tribune. And one time he called up and said, my God, I've got a mass murder out here. There's 7 people have been killed. And the guy on the other end said, what's the address. And he told him, he said, that's not a story. And my brother said, what do you mean it's not a story? 7 people are dead in a slaughter. He said, they're black people. Go on to something else. This is not a story for us. And that was the establishment Republican newspaper of the time, the New York's Herald Tribune in 1961. It was the damnedest thing. He called me up and told me that story, and I said, that can't be. Yes, it is. It is. So I don't remember the specifics of that uprising because I was going to be more traumatized when it became clear that the sword cut 2 ways. First, you had television working on your behalf of change in the South because of the absurdity and brutality and bestiality of much of the Southern reaction. But of course, what looks bad when whites do it looks bad when blacks do it. And so when things started to burn, and you had people yelling, burn, baby, burn, I swear I wrote an editorial said, this is the beginning of the end. You're going to scare the crap out of white America, and little by little, you're going to lose them.
Tonkin Gulf. 2 things happened. On August 2nd, the destroyer Turner Joy is fired upon. And then on the 4th, supposedly a second destroyer is fired upon, and 3 bodies are discovered under a dam in Mississippi.
Was that all simultaneous?
There's the fact that there isn't much of a causal. I mean,
Oh, no.
those 2 things don't really go together.
No, it don't, but nonetheless, it's interesting. That's the good thing about history books. You finally remember that there were parallel universes and things were happening, not necessarily connected, but of real substance. Time magazine had what is known as a tick-tock about the Tonkin Gulf events, which went something like, out of the dark they came, Swatow gunboats, their front guns firing upon the Americans, surprised by their presence, blah, blah, blah. And back into the mist they went, blah, 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 blah. It was the first real recognition in my head that tick-tocks like that are handouts by government information people. Because there was nobody there except government people. Time wrote it as though they were eyewitnesses to something which it turned out, as later Admiral Stockdale was going to say, didn't happen in the way described. Was it Admiral Stockdale? In any case, and Ben Bradley often at the Washington Post would say, do we lie? Yes, we do. We lie repeatedly. We repeat what the government tells us. And he said, at any rate, that's one of the great examples of that.
What did it do? What did the resolution and...
Stampeded Congress, of course, and wrote the blank check. I mean, the Tonkin Gulf provided a blank check for the expansion, which was, of course, going to come, apparently, though God knows you didn't know it at the time. I mean, that wasn't what the campaign seemed to be about. It was supposed to be the other way around. If you vote for Goldwater, you're going to get an expanded war. So I voted for Goldwater, and we got an expanded war. I mean, it's the bad joke about all of this, that Lyndon, of course, did it.
Yeah, that's the irony.
That's a terrible irony.
He goes on television that night. He seizes the leverage. He's
Immediately, he always could do that.
He's so smart about it. And he says the prophetic words, we seek no wider war.
I know. It reassured me. And again, I was gunboat, that speech. I mean, again, I was gunboats Carter. That one, we seek no wider war. I mean, because it didn't matter about being gunboats Carter. I thought we owed it to do certain things. But as I want to say again, I was beginning to have reservations. And in any case, it doesn't really matter. It's one of the problems with today. We don't seem to have quite the same reaction when President Obama does something about the expansion of a security state as we would if it were a right-wing Republican. So I knew that no matter what else, if we were going to go to the final confrontation, I wanted a good Democrat's hand on the lever instead of a crazy Republican. And that was a very deep secondary reaction, which was ideological rather than intellectual, but absolutely there.
What about the credibility issue? Is that when the gap began?
Well, you know,
It took a while.
it's a funny thing. Again, people forget this, but there are all kinds of credibility issues which arose from time to time. In the previous, I mean, in Jack's time, Kennedy's time, and lying with a smile was not perfected by Lyndon, and there was a great deal of lying with a smile or a wink or an accommodation. And the press was very accommodating to Jack Kennedy. Some of the press thought, of course, he was the agent of Moscow, the Talis Morning News among them. But it was the time at which you were going to discover, though you weren't going to discover it then, and don't think for a minute that we knew everything for quite a while,
Yeah.
that the government could do major things without telling us the truth. Back up. If you were a certain kind of Republican after Pearl Harbor, you knew that Roosevelt had deliberately obscured the fact that he knew the attack was coming. And having broken the code, as the Brits had, and we knowing a great deal about it of the Japanese, had accommodated ourselves to Pearl Harbor to force us into the war that FDR had been trying to get us into, as they saw it, for a year. While I've done a lot of work on that particular subject and don't think it was precisely that, it was easy to believe it. Mm-hmm. It was very easy to believe it. As I say, it was not the first time that people had reason to believe the government wasn't being quite straight with them about major events in their national security. So here we are. And with that, and with the expansion of the war, and with the expansion of justifications as time went on, begins another great spiral down, in some ways unbroken ever since, of American confidence in the word of the government. It took Johnson and Nixon to really do the whole deed in a significantly large way.
But it starts.
But it starts. It starts. That's both the tragedy and the irony of that time. At a moment in which there are things being offered which could confirm forever the absolute vitality of government's place in the Republic's life, we were doing things in the name of national security, which was calling into question the government's ability to tell you the plain truth about important issues.
Yeah. Great. You need 5? Should we take?
I don't care.
Okay, let's plow ahead.
I do need to switch media at some point.
All right, so let's do it now, and then I want to talk about Atlantic.
Georgetown and worked for the Reporter when I got out of school, but I had to go to the Marines first. And after that, the old man said, I tell you what, you're either coming home and telling me you're going to stay or not stay, but I ain't going to be down here dying in the ditch without you telling me, because otherwise, to hell with it. I've had about all this I want.
Interesting. Okay, home stretch. Describe Johnson's frame of mind heading into Atlantic City, and why is he so worried about things?
Well, because if Johnson could have made 100%, he would have. I mean, that is, if he could tie down every loose end. He understood he'd understood a long time, but that there was no problem, obviously, about him being nominated. The problem was, how bad was the reaction going to be across the board to a number of things, and among the things he had to be really sure of, that he could have as quiet a convention as possible. What he really didn't want was a major fight with the South, if he could avoid it. Though there was much he couldn't avoid, he thought there was some that could be avoided. And he basically wanted to be sure that while presidents do get to name their vice presidents, that nobody was going to get in his way too much on that. But he also knew who lusted for it and who didn't, and how to use that. Lyndon was really, I've often wondered about this, why it was that they were quite as nervous about the Goldwater phenomenon as they were. Doesn't matter how primitive we may think our polling was in those days, I'm not sure why, except that he was, among many other things, a paranoid, and,
He was running scared, and that's how he liked to run.
he loved to do it. And, well, he had had reason to believe in the past that things were not tidy and are preordained.
What about the MFDP? What's so threatening about that phenomenon? Where did it come from?
Well, it came from the preceding year to begin with, when the alternative ballot in Mississippi. The leaders of the MFDP at Atlantic City were essentially the leaders of the Freedom Ballot who had been educated in the process and brought into it. Al Lowenstein, strangely enough, had had a major, I don't mean to start over. Al Lowenstein had had a major role to play in the Freedom Ballot of '63. They, in essence, made a run at participation in the Democratic primary in some states. We didn't have primaries. They made a run at the Democratic caucuses in some of the counties, and then determined that this, having been utterly and totally be rebuffed, had no possibility, that the thing to do was to take their case straight to the Democratic convention with a delegation representing the excluded, to represent all those who would, among other things, strange given the future of the party, endorse the Democratic Party, which was something the Democrats of Mississippi would not do. And they...
You mean if the Mississippi Democrats were hesitating to endorse Johnson's party?
No, they weren't hesitating. At the state convention in Jackson, Mississippi, before this Democratic convention in Atlantic City, by some accident, I was a third alternate because I was a reporter covering a county convention and they didn't have enough people to make a delegation. So I went down to, all of a sudden our delegation was actually Democrats. The only county out of 82 that voted to sign a loyalty oath to the nominee of the Democratic Party was my county. The other 81 voted hell no. They weren't going to do any such thing, and they were already preparing for third-party participation, that is, the white Democrats were. The Freedom Democrats come up. They make their case to the Credentials Committee. They make a dramatic case, and, of course, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer gives the now immortalized, and they whoop me, and they whoop me, and they whoop me, what happened to her when she tried to register to vote. And at their rallies, at the end of each day, they were remarkably perfect for television, which had become a major component in the game. And the white Democrats were remarkable in their obduracy in every respect and refusal to play by any rules except their own. We have not left the party of our fathers. The party has left us, you know. And while many of the Freedom Democrats were in fact shocked to discover that they weren't going to be seated, I'm sorry, I'm just cynical enough to know that some of the others knew damn well they weren't going to be seated as intact. But they had some really major supporters of importance in the Democratic Party's left, who, as time went on, they came to believe had utterly betrayed them by not staying with them in the face of Lyndon's refusal to unseat an entire white delegation from the South.
So you're there doing what?
I'm there covering the white delegation because my brother was there with Newsweek, and so he covered the Freedom Dems and I covered the whites, and then we traded notes. Every now and then I'd go to the Freedom Dem meeting. Sometimes he would go to the white. But again, I never have understood this, but I had access there. And by that time we had long ago endorsed Lyndon and all that jazz. But so...
Who were these people? Who were the Freedom Democratic Party?
The Freedom Democratic...
How did they make you feel when you looked at them?
It made me feel a rare combination of admiration and concern, and also a sense that they were being set up for a major fall by unknown forces who knew damn well this was going to be a major disillusionment. The party, National Party, had not yet gotten itself in shape, despite the Lawrence report, despite many things, to actually reject a whole delegation, as they were going to do 4 years later when we came back up with a somewhat expanded delegation and we replaced the white delegation. But then that wasn't going to happen. That had not happened since the memory of man runneth not to the contrary. They were eloquent in their presentation of the reality of Mississippi because they were so authentic. They touched many nerves. And, of course, having done so, they, of course, made an awful lot of white liberals very uncomfortable when they were also beaten into line or persuaded into line not to go all the way and not to reject the entire Mississippi delegation. Now, the Mississippi delegation did, of course, the Freedom Democrats the great favor of refusing once more to say that they were Democrats, that they were going to sign a loyalty oath. We don't sign loyalty oaths. I mean, we're free men. Well, yeah. So, but we're here as free men to be given a pass, and they wouldn't sign it. Ultimately, 3 guys did sign it, one of whom was from my hometown, whose family was very close to Lyndon.
You looked at these MFDP people, they weren't there without taking some serious risks.
Oh, well, some of them were taking horrible risks, but they had already been taking risks. I mean, these were people who knew what they were about in the sense that many of them had already been beaten. Many of them had done alternative running for office. Many of them had been in their counties standing in line countless times to try to register to vote and been turned away because they were black or supposedly failed some test. These were people who fully understood the nature of their state and in going to Atlantic City knew that they were presenting themselves as threats to continued white hegemony. And the absolute definition of white Mississippi was that this is white man's territory. It always has been, it always will be, and this will not change. And what they were saying is, it has to change.
What's the irony of who Johnson sends to negotiate with the MFDP?
Well, again, I happen to have a book written by one of the Freedom Summer volunteers who were in my town, but more to the point, she was in the delegation. And it's very useful because it's a very passionate account of seeing the stream of people who showed up, who repudiated their labels as liberals or what have you. Well, one of the things, of course, that Bill Moyers doesn't like to concede at all is that he was working very hard to make sure that nothing bad came of this. Fitz Mondale, a nice attorney general of Minnesota, was a lead man, and ultimately Hubert Humphrey was sort of used with some of the advisor types, particularly to the Freedom Democrats like Joe Rao and others, to say, come on now, you know, you've got to pull the plug on this thing. They can't go this way. And these were not conservatives that were sent. These were liberals who were used as intermediaries. As with most conventions in those days before it became so serious, sat around drinking of a night, and Mondale was talking about how he had to do this and blah, 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 and he did. If I'd been the Freedom Democrats, like some of them, I never would have gotten over it either. I mean, the sense that the people who had been so publicly encouraging to our mission at large, which is to change the nature of the state, were not willing to take the specific step of doing something dramatic about the seating of non-Democrats and the not seating of people who profess to be real Democrats.
In this, if you step up a little bit higher view of this whole enterprise, what was really happening? What was really at stake? It's this moral issue confronting this political practice,
well,
right?
It was yet another way station toward the transformation of what was acceptable in American politics on matters of race. Morally, it was a chance for the party to break the lockhold of the South on its deliberations about issues of real importance to the South, like race. It was a way to finally say, there may be states' writers who form alternative parties, but we are now going to say those who say they're Democrats will be treated as Democrats and those who don't won't. And it was good timing. I mean, but not quite. And timing is everything. We hadn't gotten there yet. It was infuriating to many that the Democratic Party would be turning him away in the summer of the Freedom Summer and of the extraordinary burnings and killings, many of which weren't even known to the general public at that time.
Did they feel betrayed?
Totally. I don't think I know somebody from that delegation who didn't feel betrayed. And I don't profess, because I didn't know them all, though I came to know them all later. But the ones I did know were betrayed. A man who I respected immensely, and the most political of them all was Aaron Henry. But even Aaron, and I say even Aaron with respect, but even Aaron did not feel that they had been treated right, and was worried about its implications for the future of the attempt to build a Democratic Party.
What was it about Fannie Lou Hamer that seemed to encapsulate everything that this was about?
Because she did. Because she did. Because here she was, a woman not trained like the heroine in Montgomery in what she was doing.
Meaning Rosa Parks?
Rosa Parks.
Yeah.
She was not an apparently spontaneous eruption as Rosa was. She was a force of nature who arose from the most oppressed section of the most oppressed racial state in America. And she spoke her truth repeatedly to that power. And the rhetoric was not the half of it. She put her life out there on the line for voter registration, for efforts to bring people into schools, and suffered greatly, as she was to suffer the rest of her life from the effects of having the hell beat out of her for doing these things. She was, of course, also an almost perfect embodiment of the sort of basic mystical, mythical black soul. She sang, my God, she sang, and she sang with lyricism and fervor. She was a charmer in the sense that she was willing to talk to anybody and wanted to talk to everybody and wanted to believe they were going to do the right thing. And she was not a cynic. There were guys around the delegation who were cynics and there were, I mean, just to be blunt about it, some in that delegation who desperately wanted it to fail because it served their notions of how they were going to reshape the country. And, but be that as it may, she was an embodiment of the real black Mississippi aspiration for full incorporation into the republic and into the life of their nation, their state, and their party. She was wonderful.
And they had to buy her a dress.
They had to do lots of things for her, and did to the end. Did to the end. 4 years later, she wanted to nominate Ted for president, and I was co-chairman of the delegation by then. She said, I'm going to do it. I said, Ms. Hamer, they won't let us up on the podium. She said, I'm going to force my way up there. I said, Ms. Hamer, can I go with you? She said, all right. We go there. I said, this is Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm Harding Carter. I'm chairman of the delegation. We go through the first door, and we're getting ready to go up where they're going to turn us away. I said, Ms. Hamer, would you mind if I called Teddy and asked him if he wants to be? I couldn't find Teddy, but I found Steve Smith. And I said, Mr. Smith, you don't really know me, but I'm Harding Carter. Oh, yes, I'm Scott. I said, there are a number of people here, not least me, but most importantly, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who would like to see Teddy nominated and are intent on forcing a nomination somehow, including mass action. He said, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. He said, put Mrs. Hamer on and I'll put Ted on. So she gets into the booth, which she could barely fit into, and she just slumps. And she comes out all dejected, and he's not going to do it. And we walked back out again.
Great.
God, she was wonderful. All right.
She's a wonderful person.
Yeah.
God. You're on the boardwalk after the news has come out.
Oh,
right?
God. You were walking the boardwalk. It's funny. Some of what was going on then was anticipation of splits to come.
Hang on a sec. Meg, can you just shout down the stairs? We're hearing too much. Real quick.
Hey, whoever's downstairs, we can hear you when we're filming.
Okay.
Thanks.
Continue.
The boardwalk throughout the convention was sort of the place most likely to have people mix and mingle outside of the caucuses of the various states or factions. It was great fun for a lot of us, and it was illuminating for a reporter and also fun. And as the events moved along, it became increasingly clear that some old alliances were fraying badly. There was the start at that point on the national and southern scene of a continuing loss of faith of many blacks in the solidity of Jewish support for them, because by that time, a number of folks were beginning to worry about the quote-unquote radical nature of some of the civil rights thing. And there were great debates out there. I'd known Stokely Carmichael since the early 60s when they opened up SNCC in Mississippi. And we were amiable, wary participants in the same geography. And I was out there arguing with somebody, I'll never forget it, and pretending I was somebody else other than my name, because because of my father, once the name was used, I was identified too easily for people to listen to anything I had to say without stereotyping. And I'm arguing. Stokely walks up behind me and says, "You know who this honky is?" He said, "Don't believe a word that boy says. He's hiding Carter from Greenville, Mississippi, and he is a known honky." And I started laughing. He started laughing. He was still a man of humor. The buzz out there was, antithetical for the large part to what was happening as far as Mississippi was concerned. But the whole deal didn't come down totally, practically to the last minute, and then suddenly there appears on the floor a bunch of guys who have been giving floor passes by other delegations from the Freedom, on the Freedom Democratic side, and, of course, the three guys who had agreed to sign the loyalty oath from the regulars. By that time, any other kind of deal had been rejected, or ritual token to Freedom Democrats being put on the floor, whatever, had all been rejected. So there was a fair amount of scuffling down there, and all of a sudden you realize a lot of guys in blue suits were not delegates, but were security fellows.
Can you see, is Atlantic City kind of another one of those watershed moments?
I think it has to be seen for the Democratic Party as central to the transformation of its approach to a number of subjects, but most importantly to race. But once that was transformed, there was the sense, okay, that little bit of unfinished business by '68 is much more certain in its outcome, though not certain. And it was also the approach used on that subject was, as we all know, a matter both of encouragement to and reflection of the anti-war movement and its approach to Democratic conventions, which by '68 was pretty tumultuous, as I recollect from Chicago.
Yeah.
The party was in the midst of what is now its almost total transformation out of the old pattern into a new alignment which allows it to win without the Solid South, or lose without the Solid South, but no longer was a integral part of its necessities. It was something you would like to get, but you discovered that there were other ways to get there. It took a while, even so, for white Southerners en masse to desert the party. But it was inevitable.
And does it split the black community? Is black power emboldened by this? You
Well,
mentioned Stokely.
Well, I know. And of course, Stokely, I'm driving back from my Neiman year in 66. I turn on the radio and God damn it, Meredith has been shot walking into Mississippi. So they picked James Meredith and they picked up his march, and it was on a monument in one of the towns on its way down to Jackson that Stokely gets up and starts chanting Black Power. And I, of course, am paraphrasing the way it worked. But that's still to come.
Right.
It empowered an awful lot of black folks. The failure empowered a lot of black folks because it led to a reform commission, which led to a whole set of restrictions and requirements, which in '68 meant that you had delegations from many places in the South challenging or being forced into joint ventures with or otherwise different from the old all-white delegations, not least the Mississippi delegation.
So there was sort of a silver lining in the end.
Well, a silver lining 4 years later, which is of no solace whatsoever, and also because, frankly, the alignment of the various forces that eventually prevailed was not all the way where the Freedom Democrats would have been on many issues. I mean, forget racial issues, a number of others, because they were really, honest to God, liberal left. And what was formed was basically moderate left, you know. Again, by national standards, it looked pretty damn left, but in reality, it wasn't.
Do you have any sense of, Berkeley's free speech movement is in November.
I know that whole year is stunning about this.
I know.
I think of Mario, but in any case,
What do you think is going on in Berkeley? How is that interconnected with all the other things that are happening in 1964?
Look, once you see the effect of young folks on the process about which you had not seen a hell of a lot of effect before, you absolutely either empower or encourage folks to take up the cudgels for whatever seemed to be their civil rights issue.
Yeah.
And Berkeley was an exemplar, but hardly the only one. He was a master of promotion and publicity, but of course, Mario. But the fact of the matter is, the forces there behave very much like Mississippi forces in reacting to the civil rights people. They overreached in their put down and thereby empowered those who were speaking on behalf of free speech or whatever. But it wasn't the only place that was going on. That was a nation.
But what's interesting is that some of the people.
Oh, they were veterans.
Say that again. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the people there, as elsewhere, were veterans of the Freedom Summer. They had themselves tested. It was almost as though it were the Spanish Civil War, having created an entire group of people, not dead, but ready to fight for same principles everywhere else. And here they were, shock troopers in a way, and certainly aware now of the limits to which conventional America was willing to go on behalf of things, and therefore don't trust anybody over 30, among other things, becomes a mantra which they think reflects reality. If you're going to bring change, you can't trust the establishment to get it.
You worked on the general election.
Yes. Fleeing Mississippi in the sense that I was by that time so determined that the one thing that could not happen was the election, not so much of Goldwater, but of the party that he had come to represent. And knowing that there was not a thing to be done about it in Mississippi, that there was no voting base for a Democratic anything, I decided to go where I thought I could do some good. And I went off to work for him as a propagandist and of no consequence, though it was fun to be there. And so I was there through the election, after the convention, of course.
Right. There's kind of an interesting moment where Johnson doesn't want to campaign in the South, and he sends Lady Bird.
That was a brilliant thing, however.
What happened?
Well, they start off on a plane. I mean, the Lady Bird special starts off in Alexandria, Virginia. You cannot get a lot of Southerners, despite the fact that they're tight with Lyndon. You can't get them to do public stuff. On the other hand, there's Lady Bird. And she comes on down that train all the way through from Alexandria, right on down through the South, and cuts across, and stopping in all of these places where there are Democratic governors and whatever. And stunningly enough, in a few places, very strange people showed up. That is, you might not have expected them to come out. I'm not sure they would have come for Lyndon. I'm confident, however, that among the things a man did not do was to snub a lady who was the first lady of the country, and who, after all, wasn't Lyndon, it was Lady Bird, and more so. And I think they had a great time, and I think they did some good.
What does it tell you that Johnson didn't think he could go?
Well, I think that Lyndon thought that his welcome had probably been somewhat overtaxed, and that hers hadn't. I don't ever have seen that as an act of cowardice. I saw it as an act of calculation, of a matter of common sense that, again, to reverse Barry Goldwater's, it was better to go where the ducks were than to go down and simply sit there and say to Mississippians or South Carolinians or whatever, of course you want me, when you know damn well.
Right.
And I'm sure that he was advised by a number of his old buddies, and I haven't read this, but I'm sure they did, that, Lyndon, it makes no sense for you to come.
Maybe not even safe.
Yeah, and
There was a minesweeper kind of train that went 15 minutes ahead of Lady Bird's train.
I'd forgotten that. I was on the it wasn't Lady Bird, a Grasshopper special that in '68, except we went in campers.
How does the media play the whole campaign? There's the famous Daisy ad, but there's also this film called The Choice, which Goldwater creates.
Well-
Cliff White creates it, and Goldwater.
Yeah.
You remember that film? Did you ever see it?
I don't think I ever saw it.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about competing films, because what prefaced a lot of this was the war over the House Un-American Activities Committee and events in California. And there were a whole series of things about the rising red tide, which had been a part of the Democratic hegemony, and that these kids, these radical kids out here, were actually agents of Moscow. And so that there was more than one narrative being offered as to what was happening in the world, under whose direction and why.
Yeah.
And I think that they had major effects, mainly, however, to reconfirm the biases of those who saw them to begin with. They were fairly strongly confirming those who were confirmed. I mean,
Yeah. Although it's interesting, Doyle Dane Bernbach is doing Johnson's ads, and Goldwater's ads just look like they're from the 50s.
yeah, I know.
But Johnson, the red phone blinking.
Oh, I know. I know. All the reminders you wanted. I will tell you something interesting about that, however. It is almost inconceivable to think about it, but much of the South was not wired for sound. Television was not omnipresent then. So that, again, and there were stations, of course, that refused to run ads they didn't like to see across the South before we won that battle.
Yeah. Interesting. So let's just step back. We're almost done. So just
Middle 60s, and establish that you couldn't play the game they were playing, about it keeping selective coverage, selective acceptance of ads and all that.
Roger Ailes just won't take in anything on his paper that he just doesn't approve of. Just
Yeah.
completely.
Well, you can't force a newspaper, but you can damn well force the.
The Federal Commission.
yeah, right,
Federal
right.
Airways, Yeah.
And even there, it took Warren Berger to do the order. FCC turned us down.
In November, does Landslide Lyndon? What happens to Landslide Lyndon?
landslide gets his landslide, gets a landslide like you hadn't seen often before. He gets not only himself in, which was important, he gets a huge Democratic majority, almost by the standards of the very height of 36. I mean, it's just, turns out that's going to be a problem later, but I mean, because discipline begins to wear and fray. But nonetheless, he gets this great majority so that it's absolutely certain that he can get through whatever is left of his desires in the Great Society. I mean, up to a point at any rate. Therefore, the Voting Rights Act is a certainty, and even the Housing Act of the year after that, 2 years after that. It was a moment in which almost everybody fell in thrall to an illusion, which this meant the end of the Republican Party as we knew it, and we were going to have to create a new alternative party. And that we had proved that an extreme position was untenable in a national election.
Conservatism was dead.
And conservatism, if not dead, would take 2 generations to dig itself out. The hubris involved in all of that was so remarkable as to boggle your mind now. But of course, we've heard similar things since then, not least with the Reagan era, which was supposed to usher in the end of a democratic time. But the thing about it was, the only people who didn't believe they were dead were the people who were supposed to be dead. And they went from there to, of course, take over a national party in a much more substantial way than one nomination in one. Didn't happen immediately. As it turns out, Richard Nixon was a liberal compared with what was going to come. But nonetheless, they created the basis for an awful lot of fashionable talk over time that, unlike the old thing after 64, that we were in a new democratic hegemony, that in fact we were building a new Republican hegemony, thanks to their absolute refusal to go away. A lesson which keeps being lost on Democrats who keep running away from their own positions for fear of losing something today and therefore not building for tomorrow.
Right. If you had to said like 1964 was the year that, and you look back at everything we've been talking about, is there a way to kind of sum it up? Is there a way to think about it in the super big picture?
It's an interesting thing that when, in terms of numbers, a year 64 is sort of at the center of a decade. That 64 was at the center of much that was to come, and the propulsion from the past into the future through the events of 64, so that you recast the nature of the major American parties, if not totally then, but nonetheless underway. You change the entire idea about what it is that non-white Americans are supposed to be, besides spear carriers and cheerleaders for one of the 2 parties. You establish that we are, in fact, more serious than rhetorical about trying to lift up those who are down at the bottom. You establish that we are folks who understand more often than we used to what it is that we claim are our founding principles. And we establish that we even yet don't quite get it as to what's going on in the world, and that's going to rise up and bite us for a long time to come. It was, from my standards, I would pay money to go back and just live through that whole era again. I would make all the same mistakes, but I'd know, as I knew then, that I could never have asked for a better time to be involved in the affairs of my nation and in the newspaper business and the like. When I say involved in the affairs of our newspaper, our nation, I mean as a citizen, but it was an extraordinary time. In 64, I delighted in its culmination, which was the extirpation of my friends on the Republican side, except, of course, it wasn't extirpation.
Right, because they were coming back.
Yes.
Meg, final tiny bit of touch-up, just for 1 second.
The sweat...
Your damn fan, Andy. Are the genies let out of the bottle in 1964? Is there going back on any of these issues once this year has come?
You know, it's really interesting because the reaction to so much of that has informed so much of American politics ever since. The whole sense of betrayal for a whole bunch of people. The cultural stuff was yet to come in a big way, but nonetheless, that you keep thinking that there's no such thing as inevitable, quote unquote, progress. On the other hand, despite the extraordinary amount of reaction and despite much of what has been the success of political party that's opposed to what has happened, most of the basic stuff is intact. I have to tell you, however, that there are several swords that you threaten to die on that you once thought were your great prop. And one of them is a reliance on the courts. And we on the left liberal side grew accustomed to taking the most undemocratic of all our institutions to enforce our desire for a more democratic society. And the only problem with that, the court over the history of this republic has always been more likely to be conservative than liberal. And now it's coming back to bite us with a vengeance. So is there some going back? The court's going to do the best it can to take us back. And the real question is going to be, are people willing to put as much energy and effort into stopping and reversing that as they took to put us into the place we got to, which was a far better place than we were when the 60s began.
Is this the moment when is 1964 when the 60s, as we think of it, begins? Is it a watershed moment? Can you make that?
Well, you can make it, but I'm afraid I don't meet the thesis quite that well because there was so much that happened so frequently. But there is this. It is the election of a person who is expressly about things which are not new, but dynamically forward-leaning in ways that we were not used to for quite a long time. It was certainly a time, 64, in which we finally made good legislatively on promises that had been put down 10 years earlier through the Supreme Court and before that, supposedly, in Civil War and Reconstruction. So that has to be a major thing. It is also truly, from that point on, a time in which people were brought out of the political woodwork and convinced that they had to go to work because their country was being taken away from them. And so a lot of folk suddenly said, wait a minute, I haven't been paying attention here, but these guys are taking us too fast, too far on things that matter to me culturally as well as politically. So it's an interesting contrast of possibilities, but it was a big, big year.
Is it when the baby boom generation is finally, think about these 18-year-old kids?
You know, it's a hell of a note to know you have children who are supposed to be baby boomers, so I always have some doubts about what I'm supposed to believe about generations. But it was certainly a huge thrust of folk who came along while the easy complacencies of the previous period of the immediate post-war time were disintegrating and changing, and in which the idea of direct action became much more popular, if not totally absorbed. Well, let me tell you something. I'm not a big believer. I think most generations have a very small percentage of people who sort of are above the waterline when it comes to changing massive things. They are very important, but what really matters is to what degree those who are not participants buy in to that which has been created. And here, I think they have. But the one thing the conservatives turned out to be right about was you can't change the hearts of men with legislation, which is why it's imperative that you keep the legislation on the books, because you damn well can make them change their actions. And that is a great virtue of that whole period, was that you finally said the law is going to make good on the principle.
Right. Couple of
Yes, I'll kill you for this, Amanda.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
It's all right.
Summarize what's the JFK agenda that Johnson is taking into the State of the Union address, kind of? Just like, what are the big principles?
See, I can't do this. I'm sorry, dear, but I don't have those specifics in my hand. If you told me to go look them up, I didn't.
Okay.
You see,
I think we should have
Johnson's problem was he was never going to be dynamic and pretty. He was never going to be a golden boy. He was never going to be adopted by the fashionable. He was never going to be the guy that you sort of hoped your daughter would marry until you found out that he'd already married 25 others without benefit of clergy. I mean, he's
got the ears.
Yeah, he's got the hound dog and an accent which just won't wait. And if I were Lyndon, I would have been paranoid. It was and then again, I want to repeat, Southerners were used to being patronized. In many ways, it helped because we would pick the pockets of so many folks who thought they were smarter. On the other hand, it hurt because you suddenly knew that you were essentially held in some low regard by those who, in your heart of hearts, you wanted to have them think that you were of some value. Getting rid of that racial stuff was one of the great benefits that the white South got out of this, was that at least is no longer tagged as the indiscriminate way that you think of the South. Or to put it another way, Orange County, California votes exactly the same way that Henrico County outside of Richmond votes.
Right. Exactly. Didn't we ask what are conservatives upset about in 1964?
Everything. Everything. I mean, there was nothing not to be upset about. I mean, first, they actually thought they had a shot at Jack Kennedy. I mean, it just seems unthinkable now. But the fact that he had limped to victory as the first Catholic had not been enhanced thereafter by events. That is, his second thing is that Johnson, whatever else you had thought about him, you nonetheless thought, if you were a certain kind of American, that he was not a raving liberal, and it turns out here he is. He's putting out the full agenda, every step of which you understand is an assault on your idea about the government's role, about individuals' rights, and the like. If you're a conservative, you've been waiting a long time, and now all of a sudden you've got another 4 years to wait before you have a chance to begin to do any serious damage to what took place first in 1933. And I'll repeat, you think you have got in an alien country. It's the way I feel in North Carolina right now with these right-wingers in charge of every branch of government. What happened? Where did this come from? What can I do? If you're smart, you get mad and go out and organize. If you're not smart, you sulk and have a drink. And the conservatives were ready to fight.
Great. Mrs. Hamer, represents everything LBJ fought for in some ways.
Except control. Except for control. I mean, look, an awful lot of good people, a lot of people who stand for good causes understand that they personify the good cause and that they understand the best way to get there, and they understand timing, and they understand that they have to lead it. And if you're offering an alternative vision of what timing is and of what it ought to be, that is an affront in a major way to those who think that they are your, after all, sponsor and patron. And I think he found that to be unpalatable. But he also simply wanted to have as unruffled a convention as he could, so he'd come out of there and hit those next 2 months, bang, 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 and go on to victory. And he was afraid that this thing could disturb it, as of course it did in 5 states, or however many there were,
Right.
come November.
Right. Okay, last 2 questions. Why do you think it's important to look back and remember 1964?
A better question is, why is it important to look back and remember virtually every important aspect of our past? But one of the main reasons is, if you don't, then you don't understand anything at all about the present, And more to the point, you do understand that there's a great deal of massive mythology about our past, which can still bite us, can still bring us down as a democratic republic. The 60s are, of course, the object of major attack from the right as sort of the architectural building blocks of a disintegrated and degenerate new America. And if you don't make sure people understand what fundamental good things happen because of that period in the lives of many, many Americans, then of course you're even more vulnerable to the attack that these were times of real backward motion for the nation as opposed to forward. There's not a kid out there, and I've been off and on teaching, that is not my profession, but at any rate, there's hardly a kid out there that has a real appreciation of much of post-World War II American history. One, they don't get taught it in high school beyond the most limping sort of thing. And the second is it's very dangerous for an awful lot of people to teach anything which is halfway straight about what happened in that period, because it is now such a matter of huge polarization. As a result, we don't have a lot of kids who know. And if you don't understand your country and you don't understand how we got here, then you don't understand what it is that's necessary to fight for, as opposed to stand here and essentially say, so, if it's still possible for people to say, what is it the blacks want? Or if it's still possible to say, haven't we given those people all the money they need? Don't they just waste it? If it's still possible to say that, then you don't understand a damn thing.